The woman arrived at the edge of the canyon at the hour when the sun had no mercy left in it, only intention. Her name was Margaret Ashworth Belcourt, daughter of the Honorable Cecil Belcourt, Land Commissioner for the New Mexico Territory. And she sat atop a mule that strained beneath her considerable weight with a patience that bordered on saintly. Her dress, once cream-colored silk that had probably cost more than a working man's yearly wage, was torn at the hem and caked with the particular red dust of the high desert that gets inside everything it touches: cloth, skin, memory. Her dark hair had come entirely loose from its pins. Sweat traced pale lines through the road grime on her cheeks, and her eyes, grey as November sky, held the flat, still expression of a woman who has already spent all her tears and has decided to spend nothing more. Behind her rode two Apache men, neither speaking, both watching the horizon with professional disinterest. They had been sent by her father's intermediary, sent with a letter she had not been permitted to read, to deliver her to a man named Calls the Wind. She did not know his name then. She did not know anything about what waited for her beyond the canyon's lip, where the rock dropped away and the world opened into a valley so wide and so ancient-looking it seemed to predate naming itself. What she did know was this: her father had called her a disgrace. Had said it over the breakfast table with the same calm tone he used to discuss land parcels and water rights. Had told her that her size, her stubbornness, her refusal of 3 suitable matches, and her tendency to speak her mind in rooms where women were decorative furniture had made her unmarriageable in any civilized circle. He had said he was done with her. The mule picked its way down the canyon trail, loose stones skittering into the void below. Margaret Belcourt lifted her chin. Whatever waited at the bottom, she had already survived the worst of it. She was almost right about that. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The valley floor was not what she expected. She had expected, perhaps, a camp. Perhaps the kind of rough arrangement that newspaper illustrators depicted with dramatic imprecision: hide tents, cook fires. Something that would confirm the fearful picture her father's world had painted for her all her life. What she found instead was a homestead. A proper homestead, all the bones of one. There was a low adobe house with a timber-framed porch running the length of its front, the wood dark with age and cracked by sun. There was a corral of decent size, holding 4 horses and a grey mule. There was a garden plot, dry now, neglected, the soil pulled back from itself in hard grey slabs, that showed evidence of having once been worked with real intention. Pole beans had climbed a sapling trellis and been left to die on it, their dried vines hanging like old lace. The 2 Apache men who had ridden with her spoke briefly with a young boy who came out from the corral, then turned their horses without ceremony and rode back the way they had come. Margaret sat on the mule in the courtyard and waited. He came from the house. He was not a large man in the way that men who want to frighten you are large. He was lean in the way of the desert itself, economical, permanent-looking, built for endurance rather than display. His face was broad and dark, carved by sun and wind into something ageless. He wore a plain cotton shirt, work-worn trousers, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He carried no weapon. He looked at her with dark eyes that contained neither hostility nor pity, which she found disorienting in its rarity. He said, in English that held the particular cadence of a man who had learned it as a 3rd or 4th language and had decided to use it precisely, "You are Margaret." "I am," she said. "I am called Calls the Wind. You may call me Wind, if it pleases you. Come inside. You are tired." It was not a question. It was simply an accurate statement of fact, delivered without sentiment, and something about its plainness made her throat close unexpectedly. She got down from the mule unassisted, though not gracefully, her skirts catching and her boots hitting the ground harder than she intended. He did not offer his hand. He did not look away. He simply waited while she gathered herself, then turned and walked to the house, holding the door open. The interior was dim and cool in the way that thick-walled adobe houses hold their cool like a secret. The main room served as kitchen and sitting room both. There was a stone hearth, cold, its ash pale and old. A table of rough-hewn timber, 2 chairs, and a bench. A shelf holding tin cups and 3 crockery bowls. The floor was packed earth, and it had not been swept in some time. In the corner, an overturned crate held a candle stub and a worn Bible with its cover detached. It smelled of old smoke and dried sage and the particular mineral smell of rooms where grief has lived. The boy from the corral appeared in a doorway. He was perhaps 11, with his father's bone structure and watchful eyes. Behind him, a girl of maybe 7 pressed close, peering around his arm. "My children," Wind said. "This is Tomas. And Lucia." They stared at Margaret with the frank appraisal that only children and horses can get away with. She stared back. "Hello," she said. Tomas said nothing. Lucia, after a long consideration, held up a carved wooden horse, as though offering a credential. "That is a fine horse," Margaret said. Lucia put it behind her back and retreated fully behind her brother's arm. Wind moved to the cold hearth and began building a fire. Margaret stood in the center of the room and took a full inventory. The neglect was not the neglect of a lazy man. She could see that the structure itself was sound, the furniture solid. This was the neglect of a man overwhelmed. A man who had been keeping children alive and had let everything else go soft. She found a broom behind the door. She began to sweep. Wind looked up from the fire, said nothing, and returned to his work. By the time the fire was drawing properly, she had swept the main room and begun on the narrow kitchen alcove. She found a sack of dried corn, a smaller sack of beans, a rope of dried chilies hanging from a ceiling nail, and a tin of lard. There was salt and a heel of sourdough starter living barely in a clay crock, and a canteen of sourdough starter is either alive or it isn't, and the only way to know is to use it. She found an apron on a hook. She put it on. The strings barely tied, and she tied them anyway. She said, without turning from the shelf, "Do you have any onion?" A pause. "There is a cellar door outside." She went and found it. Found onions, dried and papery but sound. Found a string of garlic. Found the last 3 potatoes of what had clearly been a significant winter store, beginning now to sprout but still firm enough. She cooked for an hour without asking permission or direction. She made a pot of beans with the dried chilies and the garlic and the better part of the onions, and she made a corn cake in the cast iron pan with lard and the sourdough starter. And the house filled with steam and spice and the smell of rendered fat and char, and something that smelled as that nothing else can. It makes a space feel inhabited again. It makes a space remember what it was built for. Tomas appeared in the kitchen doorway long before the food was ready and stayed there, not speaking, watching her hands. She handed him a dried chili to tear. He tore it without comment. Lucia appeared and stood beside him, and Margaret handed her the wooden spoon to hold while she adjusted the pot. Which was a fiction. She didn't need anyone to hold the spoon, but Lucia held it with immense seriousness and did not give it back until Margaret reached for it gently. Wind ate with them at the table. He ate 2 full bowls of beans and ate the corn cake that she served him without asking. He drank black coffee she had found in a blue tin on the highest shelf, and after a long silence, he said, "It has been some time since food tasted like something." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and ate her own bowl. And did not remark on the fact that he had given her the bowl without the crack in it, or that Lucia had fallen asleep sitting up against her arm before the meal was finished. Small and trusting and warm as a hearthstone. The days settled into pattern the way days do when people are determined to survive them. Margaret woke before the children. She had taken the smaller room off the kitchen. Originally, she understood, storage for tack, and Wind had moved a corn husk mattress into it without comment, and she had made it work. She woke in the grey pre-dawn and built the kitchen fire back up and began the day's first round of bread, because the sourdough starter was alive after all, and alive things need feeding and rhythm. Wind milked the small brown goat that lived in a pen behind the corral. He brought the milk in without ceremony and set it on the shelf, and she made it into cheese when there was enough of it, pressing it with a flat stone wrapped in cloth. She learned the rhythms of the place. Learned that Lucia had nightmares on Tuesdays and Thursdays for some reason that no one could explain, and that when she woke from them she needed to hear a voice, any voice, speaking calmly about ordinary things. Margaret would sit on the edge of the small bed and describe, in some detail, the process of making pastry, the way cold butter cuts into flour, the sound it makes, the feel of it under the heel of your hand, until Lucia's breathing slowed and deepened. Learned that Tomos did not speak much but observed everything, and that if you wanted to know what he was thinking you watched his hands. Still hands meant he was content. Moving hands, turning a piece of wood, working a knot in a piece of leather, meant he was working something through. She fixed the garden. She was not a woman who had ever gardened. Belcourt women had groundskeepers for that, but she had watched enough, and the soil here, once she broke the hardpan with a steel pick she found in the barn, was dark and promising underneath. She planted what seed she found in an old tobacco tin on the barn shelf, labeled in Wynn's handwriting, squash, beans, corn. In the Apache three-sister method she had not known the name for but recognized when she saw the planting diagram he had drawn on the tin's paper lining. Wynn watched her work the soil one afternoon from the corral fence. He did not offer to help. She did not ask him to. When she stood up to rest her back and found him looking, he said, "You know about planting." "I know about watching," she said. "It is nearly the same thing." He considered this. "My wife knew about planting," he said. It was the first he had spoken of her, and Margaret recognized it for what it was, not an invitation to ask questions, but a door open to a precise width, no wider. What was she called? "Sunflower going to seed," he said. "We called her Seed." "How long?" Margaret asked. "2 winters," he said. Lucia does not remember her face. Tomos does, but he does not say so. He turned and went back to the horses, and Margaret turned and went back to the earth. And both of them carried what they carried in the particular way of people who have learned that the best you can do with grief is give it some honest labor. What Wynn did not know, what Margaret could not know, was that 40 miles northeast, in the town of Cober Wells, a man was asking questions about her. His name was Arthur Meade Belcourt. Her eldest brother. He was not a man of his father's generation, where things were done with a particular kind of cold patrician finality and left done. Arthur was of a newer, meaner kind, the kind who feels that a slight to family honor is a wound to his own skin, and who has both the resources and the smallness of spirit to pursue the settling of it at length. He sat in the back room of the Cober Wells Hotel, which served also as a lending office and the informal courthouse for disputes that the actual courthouse preferred not to hear officially. He was buying drinks for Elias Rook, who was the county's freelance problem solver, a term that covered a considerable range of activities. Rook was a lean man with colorless eyes and the kind of patience that reads as stillness until it reads as danger. A woman of her particular dimensions, Arthur was saying, cannot simply disappear into this landscape without someone having seen her moved through it. Canyon country swallows people, Rook said. That's its nature. Find me which canyon, Arthur said. He slid an envelope across the table. My father made a gesture in anger. I intend to correct it. The woman needs to come home. Rook picked up the envelope without opening it. His expression suggested he would open it later, in private, which was its own kind of statement about his operational style. And the Apache? Rook asked. Arthur Belcourt straightened his collar. That arrangement, he said, is obviously illegitimate. No court would. This is canyon country, Rook said again, mildly. Courts have a long walk from here. He drank his whiskey and set the glass down precisely and went out into the night. And Arthur Belcourt sat in the lamplit room and told himself he was acting out of duty, and almost believed it. There came a morning when the coffee tin was empty and the salt supply was critically low, and these are the things that force decisions. Wind hitched the wagon and they went into Cielo Flat, which was the nearest settlement of any size, a town of perhaps 300 souls arranged around a main street of convincing permanence, with a mercantile, a church, a saloon, a livery stable, and the usual satellite of smaller functions that grow around these central organs. There was also, Margaret noted, a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Crane who seemed to function as the town's moral atmosphere, the way certain weather systems organize themselves around a central pressure point. Margaret sat on the wagon bench beside Wind with Lucia between them and Tomos in the bed behind, and she was aware, from the moment they turned onto the main street, of the quality of attention they collected. It was not the attention of hostility exactly, not yet, but of intense calculation. She was a white woman of considerable presence. He was Apache in a town that had built its comfort on a particular set of assumptions about who belonged where. They were together on a wagon seat, and the children were between them, and there was no reading of it that any observer could make that would settle comfortably into the categories available. She walked into Hester's mercantile with her chin at the angle her mother had once described as her impossible angle, which was the angle that meant she was frightened and would not allow it to show. The proprietress, Hester Pratt, was a compact woman of 50 with small, assessing eyes and the manner of someone who considers information a form of currency. She measured Margaret with a single glance that took in the dress, respectable, if not fashionable, the hair, pinned properly, and the body, substantial, unapologetic, and arrived at some provisional verdict. "You'll be the woman out at Wind's place," she said. "I am Margaret Belcourt," Margaret said. "I need coffee, salt, a bolt of cotton muslin if you have it in grey or brown, and whatever dried fruit you're carrying." It was not a performance of normalcy. It was simply normal, delivered in the register of a woman who has spent her life learning that the best armor is competence plainly applied. Mrs. Crane arrived, as if summoned by the particular vibration of social complexity, before Margaret had finished her order. She was a tall woman in black that was not mourning but preference, with silver hair dressed so severely it looked architectural. "Mrs. Belcourt," she said, though no introduction had been made. The effect was intended to unsettle, and Margaret recognized it from 100 drawing rooms. "Miss," Margaret said pleasantly. "I am not married." "Indeed," said Mrs. Crane. "That is rather the subject at hand." She folded her hands. "I am told you are residing at the homestead of Mr. Calls the Wind. And that there are children present." "There are 2 children present," Margaret said. "His children. They are well fed and clothed and both of them can read. The boy is working on his second language, and the girl can identify 37 birds by call alone, which is more than most grown men in any room I have ever stood in." "The arrangement, Mrs. Crane said, choosing the word with care, "is a domestic arrangement," Margaret said. "I cook and tend the house and the garden. He runs the stock and the land. The children are minded. Everyone eats." "And what," said Mrs. Crane, lowering her voice to the tone that suggests everyone in the room is not supposed to hear and ensures that everyone in the room does he provide to you?" The mercantile was very quiet. Margaret set her hands flat on the counter and looked at Mrs. Crane with a directness that women of Mrs. Crane's type generally deploy but rarely receive. "He provides," she said, "a home. He provides safety. He provides his children's company, which is superior to most adult company I have encountered. He does not call me a disgrace at the breakfast table. He does not offer my comfort or my whereabouts to other people's judgment." She paused. "He fixes things that are broken. He does so without being asked and without expecting praise. In my experience, that is rarer than gold and considerably more valuable." She turned back to Hester Pratt. "The muslin," she said. "Grey, if you have it." Wind, meanwhile, had gone to the livery to speak to a man named Cord Halsey about the possibility of acquiring a second milk goat, because Lucia needed more than the one was producing. And this was the kind of conversation that required patient negotiation conducted in the specific language of men who respect livestock and each other's knowledge of it. It was going well. It was going well until the deputy sheriff, a young man named Porter who wore his authority the way young men do when they're not quite sure it fits yet, came in and stood in the door. "Wind," Porter said. "Deputy," Wind said, not turning from the goat he was examining. "There's talk," Porter said, "about the situation at your place." "There is talk about most things," Wind said. The goat is sound. Her feet are good. Yes, sir, but her teeth, Wind said, are excellent. She will produce for 3 more years minimum. He turned to look at Porter, and something in the quality of his looking made the young man adjust his posture. Whatever the talk is, I suggest you let it be talk. I have done nothing that requires a deputy's attention. My children are healthy. My land is mine by treaty right and by deed registered in this county in the year 1881. The woman in my house is there by her own will and is not a prisoner of anything except, possibly, good judgment. Porter opened his mouth and closed it and left, and Cord Halsey said, I'll give you the goat for the price of the work you did on my fence last spring. That is a fair trade, Wind said. They shook hands in the way of men who mean it. The night Elias Rook came to the homestead, there was no moon. It was the kind of dark that the desert manufactures in earnest, not the city dark that is really just dimness, but a full, operational dark that has weight and texture. The stars were brilliant and useless for seeing anything close. Wind had banked the fire low and gone to his room, and Margaret had gone to hers, and the children were sleeping, and the house was breathing the slow breath of a place at rest. Wind came awake the way he always came awake, completely, and without transition, the way a man does who has spent years requiring himself to be ready. He lay still. The horses in the corral were not making noise, but they were making the specific kind of not noise that is different from sleep. The absence of the small shifting sounds they make when they are at ease. He rose without a lamp. He dressed in the dark, by touch, and took his rifle from the pegs above the door. He did not load it in the room. Tomas sometimes walked in the night, and a loaded rifle in a dark room where a child might appear was a thing he would not risk. He loaded it on the porch, moving the action in the particular way that produces almost no sound if you have practiced it enough times, and he had. There was a man at the edge of the garden. Just standing. Which is its own kind of provocation. A man who stands at the edge of your garden in the dead dark and does not move is communicating something more deliberate than trespass. Wind stepped off the porch into the dirt and moved to the left, away from the house line, so that the house was not behind him. You are on my land, he said. His voice was level and not loud. It did not need to be. Looking for a woman, the man said. He had a flat, southwestern voice, regional but without the warmth that region sometimes carries. Margaret Belcourt. Her family wants her back. She is not property, Wind said. Her brother says otherwise. Says there's no legal standing for her situation here. Says a judge in Santa Fe would agree. A judge in Santa Fe, Wind said, is in Santa Fe. For now, the man said. A long silence occupied itself between them, and Wind studied the shape of the man in the dark and assessed the posture, shoulders angled right, which meant he was right-hand. And his right hand was at his side in the kind of studied casualness that means awareness of it. Tell me your name, Wind said. Rook. Mr. Rook, Wind said. I have no quarrel with you. You are a man who has been hired to do a thing. I am telling you the thing cannot be done. The woman is here of her own will. She will leave of her own will, and not before. If you or the man who hired you attempts to change this, he paused. The rifle was at his side, fully loaded, the safety knot engaged. The desert is very large, he said. And I know every yard of it. It was not a threat precisely. It was a statement of geography, offered plainly, with all its implications intact. Rook stood for another moment. Then he said, I'll carry your answer back. Do, Wind said. He watched until the sound of a horse moving away through the rock wash faded to nothing. Then he stood in the dark garden a while longer, not moving, which is how you confirm that one man leaving does not mean the situation is concluded. He went back inside. He did not go back to his room. He sat in the chair by the banked fire and held the rifle across his knees, and he was still sitting that way when the grey pre-dawn came. Margaret found him there when she came to build the kitchen fire. She looked at him. She looked at the rifle. She looked at him again. She said nothing for a long moment. She put the kettle on. She cut the morning's bread. She set a cup of coffee on the table beside his chair. Then she said, quietly, "How bad?" "A man named Rook," he said. "Sent by your brother. He will go back and report that the situation is not simple. Your brother will think of something else." "My brother," she said, "has never in his life done something that required genuine courage. And so he works through intermediaries." She sat down on the bench across from him. "What do we do?" "We think clearly," he said. "And we do it today." She nodded. Outside, the first birds of morning were locating themselves in the grey air, calling back and forth to confirm each other's presence. Lucia would be up soon, hair in her eyes, wanting her milk warm. "Wind," Margaret said. He looked at her. "Whatever we decide," she said, "decide it as though I am a person with standing in my own life. I have had enough of decisions made about me." He considered her across the firelight. "I have never thought of you otherwise," he said. And this was so plainly true, and so plainly stated, that she had to look away at the window, where the sky was turning the color of pewter, going warm at the edges. There was, in Cielo Flat, a man named Judge Alvaro Sepulveda, who had retired from the federal bench in 1889 on account of his knees, which gave him genuine agony in damp weather, and settled in the high desert where the air was dry enough to suit his knees even if nothing else about the situation suited him. He was a man of 70, with a reading comprehension that remained formidable and an opinion of most people's legal thinking that could be described as low. Wynne drove the wagon to his house on a Tuesday, because Tuesday was the day Judge Sepulveda received visitors, a rule he maintained with the seriousness of a still-sitting justice. He received them in his study, a room whose walls were so completely given over to books that the window appeared to have been cut through the books as an afterthought. He read the papers Wynne had brought, the land deed, the treaty reference, and a document that Margaret had drafted in careful longhand the previous evening by firelight. Her handwriting clean and precise in the way of women educated in the 1870s who were taught penmanship as a serious discipline. Sepulveda read for a long time. He turned a page. He went back. He removed his spectacles and polished them and replaced them and read again. "Miss Belcourt," he said at last. "This declaration you have written here. You are stating of your own free will and full cognizance that you reside on the homestead of—" "Yes," she said. "And that you entered this arrangement." "I did not enter it freely to begin with," she said. "I was delivered here against my will, by my father's instruction. But I remained freely. There is a distinction. And I believe the law recognizes it." Sepulveda looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years being impressed reluctantly and has gotten good at concealing it. "There is a further matter," Wynne said. He set another document on the desk. "I am requesting that the homestead deed be amended. I wish to add Margaret Belcourt as a co-holder of the property." Sepulveda looked at the document. He looked at Wynne. He looked at Margaret. "That is a significant legal step," he said. "Yes," Wynne said. "And you are proposing this, because it is practical," Wynne said. "Because she has worked this land and improved it. Because my children know her. Because," he paused, and in the pause there was the full weight of a man who does not spend words carelessly and is therefore spending these ones with enormous deliberateness. "Because she deserves to have ground beneath her feet that no one can pull away from her. She has had enough of ground that other people own." The judge set down the pen he had picked up and folded his hands. "Miss Belcourt," he said, "you are aware that your brother has made inquiries with the county about your status." "I am aware," she said. "My brother's interest in my status is new and entirely correlated with the question of whether I might eventually inherit a portion of my father's land holdings, which," she smiled, briefly, without warmth, "I have recently been informed is not as settled a question as he had assumed. My father's will, as drafted, does not actually contain the provision he believed it did." Sepulveda raised one grey eyebrow. "You have seen the will." "My father's solicitor in Santa Fe is a man named Hargrove who believes, perhaps correctly, that women of intelligence are wasted in decorative arrangements. He sent me a copy of the relevant section at my request 3 weeks ago. The post is slow but reliable. The judge was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your brother will contest a property amendment." "Let him contest it," Margaret said. From Santa Fe. "In a court, where I will appear, with my declaration, with the deed, with my own 2 feet on the floor, and explain myself to any judge willing to hear it. I have never in my life been given the opportunity to explain myself to anyone official, and I would find it genuinely refreshing." Sepulveda looked at Wind. Wind said, "She speaks for herself. I have found it is the better policy." The judge, for the first time in the interview, smiled. It was small and brief, and he covered it immediately with the professional gravity required of the situation. But it had been there. He picked up his pen. The news traveled through Cielo Flat in the way that news travels in small places, comprehensively and with elaboration. By Friday, the broad facts were known. The Belcourt woman at Wind's homestead had gone before Judge Sepulveda, had made a legal declaration, had been added to the property deed, and was, by every legal standard available, exactly where she had chosen to be. Mrs. Dorothea Crane, to the considerable surprise of those who knew her, came to the Mercantile on Saturday morning when Margaret was there collecting a supply order. And she stood for a moment in what appeared to be genuine internal conflict, and then said, "The corn cake. You made one for Reverend Hollis's wife when she was poorly last month, and she said it was the finest thing she'd eaten." Margaret looked at her. "I would like the recipe," Mrs. Crane said. It cost her something, the asking. The cost was visible and honest, and Margaret appreciated both. "Come to the house," Margaret said. "I will show you better than I can tell you." It was not a friendship, not then. But it was a beginning, which is all any honest thing can claim to be at the start. Arthur Belcourt received word through Rook, who had taken the job purely as a calculation and was sufficiently pragmatic to recalculate, that the legal avenue was foreclosed without a sustained and expensive challenge in federal court, and that the woman on the ground did not appear to be a woman in distress requiring rescue, and that the Apache was a man with a legitimate property deed and treaty standing and the particular kind of reputation that made the alternative approaches inadvisable. Arthur Belcourt was not a brave man. He was a man who operated through the path of least resistance, and the resistance here had thickened beyond what he was prepared to navigate. He turned his attention to other matters. The Land Commission had questions about water rights on the Pecos that required his attendance. He was a man with a great many interests and a short attention span for any one of them. He did not come to the canyon country. He did not send Rook again. The valley received this information in its own way, which is to say the valley did not receive information. But the people in it noticed that the particular tension of the past weeks had not arrived in their sleep for several nights running, and that things were quieter, and that the wind coming through the canyon in the evening had the smell of the coming summer rains, distant still but building. Tomas, who had not spoken to Margaret directly in all the weeks of her presence, came to her one evening when she was mending a tear in Wind's work shirt on the porch, and sat beside her without invitation, and after a long silence said, "Can you teach me the letters? The written ones?" She looked at him. His hands were still. "I can," she said. "We will start tomorrow." He nodded and went back inside, and she heard him in there speaking to Lucia in the low, private language siblings develop, and Lucia's laugh, which was the sound of water finding a small drop and being delighted by it. Wind came and sat in the other chair. He had been at the corral. He smelled of horse and hay and clean sweat. He watched the last light going orange behind the canyon wall. "Tomas asked me about the letters," she said. "He has been wanting to ask you for some time," Wind said. "He does not ask things quickly. He is like his father," she said. Wind was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." The evening came down soft and warm, and somewhere in the garden the first of the squash had broken the soil surface. A small impossible green comma in the red earth that had nothing to recommend it yet except the bare stubborn fact of its existence. This is the thing about the desert that people who have not lived in it do not understand. It does not forgive. It is not built for forgiveness. But it does something older and harder than forgiving. It continues. It receives whatever falls into it, and it keeps moving, and given time and rain and the particular stubbornness of root systems, things grow back. Margaret Belcourt, who had been delivered to a canyon's edge as a punishment, learned that the canyon did not know she was supposed to be ashamed of herself. The red rock and the hard soil and the ancient light did not participate in her father's assessment of her value. And the man who lived there, who built his fires without ceremony and fixed broken things without praise and held the rifle steady through a dark night without asking whether she was worth the trouble, he did not participate either. There are people in this world who will spend your whole life telling you what you are. And then there are the people who simply treat you as what you are, plainly, without negotiation, and let you discover the rest. Calls the Wind was the second kind. And Margaret, who had spent 30 years being told her body and her will and her mind were too much of everything, found in the canyon country that too much was exactly sufficient for the garden. For the children, for the long work of a life built from honest hands on honest ground. The broken places grew back strongest. They always do. Like this story? Share it with someone who needs to hear that the right people will see exactly who you are, and call it enough.